The chamber was cloaked in velvet darkness, broken only by the trembling light of a single torch. It hissed as the oil fed its flame, casting long shadows across the silken drapes. In that uneasy glow, one could almost hear the whispers of history itself, whispers that spoke not of kings and queens alone, but of those hidden figures whose bodies and souls were the true battleground of empires. Desire and fear mingled here, in silence. And a question lingers like smoke. Were these men victims of power, pawns of lust, or secret wielders of a subtler dominion? From the earliest kingdoms to the most glittering courts, the institution of concubinage carried within it a paradox: shame and prestige, vulnerability and influence, captivity and freedom. The word itself often conjures the image of women, their fates tied to the pleasure of emperors, sultans, or kings. Yet, in the dim corridors of history lies another story, more rarely spoken, more shrouded in secrecy, the story of male concubines. They were slaves, servants, lovers, confidants. Some were mutilated, made eunuchs to sever them from lineage, while others were exalted as favorites, granted jewels and titles beyond imagination. They stood at the very edge of power, their bodies offered as tokens of loyalty or seized as spoils of conquest. Yet their influence could be immense, for to touch the ruler's heart or to share his bed was to brush against destiny itself. The world of male concubinage is not a single tale, but a tapestry woven across continents and centuries. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets record contracts binding boys into the service of kings. In China, the courts of the Han and Tang dynasties whispered with stories of emperors enthralled by male beauty. In Rome, emperors like Hadrian elevated their companions into legends, while others courted scandal and ruin. The caliphs of Baghdad surrounded themselves with male favorites, even as clerics debated the morality of desire. In the Ottoman palaces, black eunuchs stood watch over gilded chambers, wielding influence in silence. And in Japan, the bonds of samurai and their chosen pages blended loyalty, intimacy, and ritual. Each empire, each court layered its own meaning onto these relationships. Sometimes they were acts of domination, reminders that a ruler owned not only the land, but also the flesh of his subjects. Sometimes they were acts of love, where poetry and memory outlived scandal. Sometimes they were acts of survival, where a smile or a submission meant life, while refusal meant death. The motif of shadows clings to this history, for shadows both conceal and reveal. The concubine existed in shadow, half seen, half forgotten. His voice was rarely written in the annals of official history. Yet in the shadow also lay possibility. Influence whispered into the ruler's ear, secrets overheard, ambitions born in silence. These men may not have sat upon thrones, but their proximity to thrones made them dangerous and indispensable. Power has always been drawn to intimacy. The closer one comes to the body of a king, the more one risks becoming both cherished and destroyed. For rulers, the male concubine was both temptation and threat. He could offer companionship free of dynastic entanglements, no offspring to challenge succession, no rival bloodline to claim inheritance. But he could also become a rival in another sense, too beloved, too trusted, too resented by other courtiers. History shows us, again and again, that the bedchamber is no less political than the battlefield. This story is not only about politics, however. It is also about the human condition, the yearning to be seen, the fear of being discarded, the wound of living as both ornament and prisoner. The scars of male concubines were often invisible, carved into memory and silence rather than flesh. To speak of them is to unearth what history tried to bury. It is to ask whether intimacy under compulsion can ever be called love, and whether survival at such a price erodes or affirms human dignity. What is striking, too, is how society responded to these men. They were simultaneously reviled and envied, pitied and feared. Rumors painted them as corrupters, betrayers, unnatural creatures. Yet their influence was undeniable. Dynasties rose and fell in part because of whispered affections in the night. Great poets wrote verses inspired by their beauty, and even moralists, while condemning the practice, could not ignore its persistence. Why, then, were their names erased so often? Why did history remember the rulers but not the hands that touched them, the eyes that met theirs across silk-draped chambers? Perhaps because memory itself is a battlefield, and the victors choose what is told. Yet fragments remain in poetry, gossip, inscriptions, travelogues, and scandalous accusations preserved by enemies. It is through these fragments that we glimpse their world, though never fully, as if peering through a half-opened curtain. The tale of male concubines is therefore both universal and elusive. It forces us to reckon with the cost of power and the ambiguity of desire. It asks us to imagine the daily life of those who lived between silence and spectacle, between slavery and influence. And above all, it reminds us that history is not only the story of generals and kings, but also of those whose very existence was both secret and central. As this journey begins, the reader is invited not only to witness, but to reflect. What is the true price of intimacy under the weight of empire? Is survival through submission a form of strength or surrender? And what does it mean ultimately to be remembered not as a king, but as his shadow? In the end, the torch still flickers, the shadows still whisper, and the story of male concubines waits to be told, not as an echo, but as a voice reclaimed. The first written words of humankind were etched into clay with reed and pressure, but hidden within those wedge-shaped signs are whispers of more than trade and tribute. In the tablets of Mesopotamia, the cradle of kingship and empire, appear contracts, lists, and decrees that hint at the silent world of male concubinage. The palaces of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria were not only centers of administration and religion, they were theaters of desire, ritual, and power. And in the shadows of their high walls, some men lived as concubines, servants and companions to rulers who claimed dominion over both land and flesh. The forbidden chamber was not a single room, but a recurring institution across ancient empires. In Mesopotamia, kingship was understood as divine stewardship. The king was chosen by the gods, and his body was a vessel of cosmic order. Those permitted to share in his bed were therefore not simply partners in passion, but participants in a sacred and dangerous intimacy. To be admitted meant privilege, but also exposure. Exposure to jealousy, to ritual obligations, and to the king's unpredictable moods. Archaeologists have uncovered tablets that record young men being dedicated to temple or palace service. Some were taken as spoils of war, others as offerings from vassal states eager to demonstrate loyalty. In Akkadian texts, there are subtle references to shirku, property of the palace, a term that could refer to both enslaved workers and those assigned to serve in personal quarters. These men were clothed in finery, perfumed with oils, and taught manners of submission. Yet their status was paradoxical, elevated above common servants, yet never free. The theme of silence haunts these chambers. Official chronicles almost never name the men who shared a ruler's bed, but enemies were quick to weaponize rumor. When a king was seen as weak or indulgent, accusations of being enthralled by male companions often appeared in rival inscriptions, Desire became political vulnerability, a crack in the armor of divine authority. Ancient Egypt provides another glimpse, though filtered through ritual and myth. Pharaohs surrounded themselves with harems, often imagined only as female, but Egyptian art and texts reveal a more complex reality. In the reign of Pepi II of the Old Kingdom, a tale survives half myth, half accusation, that the young pharaoh cherished a male lover who came to him by night. Whether true or slander, the story reveals that the idea of a male favorite in the royal chamber was imaginable, and in its very telling, dangerous. The Egyptians believed the pharaoh embodied Horus, the living god. To touch him was to touch divinity. In temple carvings, attendants sometimes stand in ambiguous roles, youthful figures with delicate features. Were they servants, priests, or companions of a more intimate nature? The lines blur, and the silence of the stone suggests what words dared not inscribe. Concubinage in these early civilizations was never only about love, it was about control, display, and the weaving of hierarchy into the body itself. The king, by possessing men as well as women, demonstrated absolute dominion. Nothing lay beyond his reach, not even the bodies of those who might otherwise symbolize strength, lineage, or rebellion. By transforming young men into concubines, rulers inverted the normal order of masculinity, displaying that their will could unmake even the natural expectations of gender and status. Yet it would be wrong to see only cruelty. Fragments of poetry, rare but luminous, suggest that affection sometimes bloomed within these arrangements. In Babylonian love incantations, voices speak of longing for the beauty of another youth. His eyes, bright as copper, his skin like polished stone. Such verses may not have been written by concubines themselves, but they remind us that even in systems of domination, the human heart reached for tenderness. Perhaps in the private darkness of a chamber, behind heavy curtains, a ruler and his chosen companion found moments of something resembling love, fragile, fleeting, and dangerous. The price of such closeness was always risk. Rivals at court resented the influence of those allowed into the king's private life. A whisper could ruin a favorite, branding him as corrupt, foreign, or treacherous. In Assyria, a clay tablet records the punishment of a palace servant accused of conspiring against his lord. Whether the charge was real or fabricated, the truth is that proximity to the king brought both power and peril. The motif of scars also belongs here, though often hidden beneath robes of silk. Castration, a practice known in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, marked many concubines. To strip a man of his generative power was to ensure that he could never establish a rival dynasty, never claim legitimacy through children. It was also a brutal reminder that his body was no longer his own. The scar was not only physical, it was symbolic, a wound that announced possession and subjugation. Yet, paradoxically, eunuchs sometimes gained immense influence, for rulers trusted them with secrets, administration, and even armies. Their lack of heirs was seen as assurance of loyalty, even as their silenced masculinity made them feared and mocked. And so, in the Forbidden Chamber, we see the full spectrum of human experience: desire and domination, tenderness and terror, survival and silence. The men who lived in these spaces were both privileged and imprisoned, ornaments of luxury and instruments of politics. They existed in the twilight between visibility and erasure, their stories only hinted at by gossip, poetry, and fragments of stone. It is here, at the dawn of civilization, that the figure of the male concubine first emerges, a man made both more and less than himself, elevated and diminished, cherished and despised. His existence asks a question that would echo through the centuries: can intimacy under coercion ever be called love? And when power takes possession of the body, does the soul survive in shadow, or is it consumed in silence? The torch of history moves onward, but the echo of the forbidden chamber lingers, reminding us that beneath the grandeur of kingship lies a darker truth. Empires were not only built on conquest and law, but on bodies offered, bound, and remembered only as whispers in the dark. The palace of the Han Emperor glittered with jade, silk, and ritual. Lanterns swayed in the courtyards, casting honey-colored light across lacquered beams. Musicians played in hidden alcoves, their notes rising and falling like breath itself. Yet beyond the grandeur, in chambers where only whispers dared to enter, another kind of power stirred. For in imperial China, emperors did not always share their lives with wives alone. The silken embrace of male concubines left an imprint upon dynasties, sometimes binding rulers in chains of desire stronger than any law. The idea of the Nanchong male favorites was not a passing scandal, but a recurring thread through Chinese history. As early as the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, records speak of emperors who favored young men, elevating them to positions of influence. The Book of Han recounts Emperor Ai's devotion to his companion Dong Xian, a man of striking beauty and gentle manner. Their bond became so consuming that, when political rivals urged restraint, the emperor declared that Dong Xian was as necessary to him as breath itself. When Emperor Ai died suddenly, Dong Xian's brief rise ended in forced suicide, but the story endured, remembered for its intensity and tragedy. This tale gave birth to one of the most enduring metaphors in Chinese literature, the passion of the cut sleeve. It was said that one night, Dong Xian fell asleep upon the emperor's robe. Rather than disturb his lover's rest, Emperor Ai cut off his sleeve to rise. That act of tenderness, small yet profound, became a symbol of male love, whispered through centuries of poetry and prose. To speak of the cut sleeve was to speak of desire between men, often couched in elegance and metaphor, to evade censure. Yet tenderness coexisted with peril. To be favored by the Son of Heaven was to walk a blade's edge. The emperor's love could elevate a man overnight, granting him estates, titles, and authority. But love could also provoke envy. Ministers, generals, and eunuchs all watched closely, fearing the influence of those who warmed the imperial bed. A single accusation could undo everything. Thus, the silk that draped the concubine's shoulders was also a chain binding him to the emperor's volatile favor. During the Tang dynasty, when poetry reached its golden age, male beauty was openly celebrated. Court poets described young men with skin like jade and hair like flowing ink, moving with grace among the palace gardens. Some emperors indulged these affections without shame, seeing them as natural expressions of refinement. But others cloaked their attachments in secrecy, aware of the Confucian scholars who frowned upon passions that seemed to blur duty and indulgence. The Confucian ideal was order, hierarchy, and filial continuity. The family, rooted in lineage, was the foundation of society. Male concubinage, by its very nature, challenged this ideal. A male concubine could not bear heirs. His intimacy with the emperor produced no continuation of bloodline. Critics saw such relationships as diversions, threats to dynastic stability. And yet, they endured testimony to the truth that human desire often exceeds the confines of philosophy. Eunuchs played a central role in this story. Castrated in youth, they became the keepers of the palace, trusted precisely because they could not establish rival dynasties. but among them were those chosen for beauty as well as loyalty, raised to serve the emperor personally. Some became favorites, rising to extraordinary power. In later dynasties, eunuchs like Wei Zhongxian controlled vast political machinery, their origins as concubines or attendants obscured by the scale of their ambition. Their bodies bore scars of mutilation, but their influence shaped emperors and empires alike. What is most striking is the tension between erasure and memory. Official chronicles often downplayed or omitted the names of male favorites, yet literature could not forget them. Stories of the cut sleeve, or of emperors sharing the pillow with male companions, circulated in coded language. They were preserved not in histories of conquest, but in the verses of poets, in the secret recollections of courtiers, in private letters. Desire, forbidden or dangerous, found sanctuary in art. The motif of shadows returns here. The male concubine existed in the emperor's shadow, his life dependent on the ruler's gaze. To be unseen was to be nothing. To be seen was to be at risk. Every gesture mattered: the way he poured wine, the way he bowed, the way his eyes met or avoided the emperor's. A slip could be interpreted as arrogance, indifference, or betrayal. In such an atmosphere, love itself became a performance, sincerity indistinguishable from survival. But perhaps love did exist. The story of Emperor Ai and Dongxian resonates not because of scandal, but because of tenderness. The cutting of the sleeve was an act of mercy, an unwillingness to wake a lover. That small choice speaks across time. Even in a palace where power defined every relationship, the human heart sought moments of gentleness. The duality of silk and chains encapsulates the world of Chinese male concubines. Silk symbolized luxury, beauty, and refinement, the gifts heaped upon favorites. Chains symbolized constraint, the invisible bonds of dependence and fear. To live as a concubine was to move between these extremes, never certain which would define the next dawn. Philosophically, the figure of the male concubine in imperial China forces us to confront a question that transcends centuries. What is the nature of intimacy when it intersects with power? Can genuine affection survive when one life depends wholly on another's favor? And if love is shaped by fear, is it still love or something else entirely? As the lanterns flicker in the imagined halls of the Han and Tang, we are left with the vision of a man draped in silk, his heart both exalted and imprisoned. His name may be lost to time, but his story persists, carried in the metaphor of a cut sleeve, in the poetry of desire, and in the silence of memory. For in China, as elsewhere, the palace was not only a seat of government, it was a chamber of shadows, where power and passion entwined, and where the price of favor could be life itself. The marble of Rome gleamed beneath the sun, its arches and aqueducts proclaiming the might of empire. In its forums, senators debated law. In its arenas, blood spilled for spectacle. In its temples, incense curled toward the gods. But behind the grandeur, within palaces where only chosen eyes could look, another Rome existed, a Rome of whispered affections, secret scandals, and male companions who shaped emperors' lives. These were the hidden lovers of Rome, men whose intimacy with rulers became both legend and liability. Roman society was not unfamiliar with same-sex desire. Among citizens, especially the elite, relationships between older men and younger companions were known, though bound by strict expectations of role and decorum. What scandalized the Roman imagination was not the existence of male lovers, but the fear that emperors might allow passion to overrule duty or blur the hierarchy that sustained Roman order. To love was permitted, To be ruled by love was weakness, and weakness in the empire of iron was unforgivable. One of the most famous stories is that of Hadrian and Antinous. Hadrian, the philosopher emperor, traveled widely across the empire, building temples and codifying laws. Yet it was his love for a youth from Bithynia that etched itself deepest into memory. Antinous was beautiful, his presence graceful as a carved statue come alive. He accompanied Hadrian on journeys, standing not only as companion, but as reflection of the emperor's yearning for beauty, youth, and eternity. When Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile in 130 CE, Hadrian's grief was overwhelming. He wept openly, defying Roman stoicism. More than that, he consecrated Antinous as divine, founding cities and temples in his name. Statues of Antinous, carved in the idealized Greek style, spread across the empire, so many that his image became one of the most reproduced in antiquity. For Hadrian, love overcame the silence of death. For Rome, it provoked unease. Was this devotion the act of a philosopher king, or evidence that passion had ensnared him? Not all emperors treated their favorites with such reverence. The reign of Elagabalus, a teenager raised to power by family intrigue, became notorious for scandal. Ancient historians, eager to depict him as decadent and unfit, filled their chronicles with tales of his extravagance. Among them was his delight in male lovers and his desire to elevate them publicly. Cassius Dio wrote that Elagabalus married his charioteer, a man named Hierocles, calling him husband, and himself the wife. Whether exaggerated or true, these accounts cemented Elagabalus's reputation as a ruler who blurred every boundary, gender, decorum, and imperial dignity. To his enemies, his indulgence was a symptom of chaos, proof that Rome itself was unraveling under his reign. Thus, male concubinage in Rome was less about existence than about perception. Hadrian's Antinous became a symbol of divine beauty, romanticized even by later generations. Elagabalus's Hierocles became a symbol of corruption, wielded as propaganda by senators eager to justify his downfall. In both cases, intimacy was inseparable from politics, and love could not be disentangled from power. Beyond emperors, other Roman elites also kept male companions, slaves, freedmen, or favorites. Yet their names rarely entered history. Power shaped who was remembered and who was erased. The emperor's bedchamber was both a stage and a prison. Those who entered might rise beyond imagination or vanish into obscurity. The motif of blood appears here, for in Rome, scandal often ended in violence. Rivals resented the influence of male favorites, accusing them of conspiring, corrupting, or distracting the emperor. Some were executed, others forced to suicide. Their closeness to power turned into proof of treachery. Intimacy was never safe. To love an emperor was to live with a sword hanging silently above one's head. Yet philosophy lingers even in these tales. The Stoics taught restraint, warning against enslavement to desire. They urged the cultivation of virtue as freedom from passion. But history shows us emperors who, despite such teachings, surrendered to the pull of companionship. What then is virtue in the face of longing? Can an emperor, charged with ruling millions, be condemned for seeking solace in the arms of one who offered no threat of dynastic ambition? Hadrian's temples to Antinous suggest another answer. Love, even when scandalous, may outlast politics. Statues of Antinous survived long after Hadrian's death, gazing serenely from museums today. They remind us that while Rome's senators condemned and its historians exaggerated, something tender persisted beneath the marble of empire. In the act of deifying his lover, Hadrian preserved not only a memory but a question: can passion itself be sacred? The shadows of Rome's hidden lovers stretch far. They reveal the fragility of power, the hunger of the human heart, and the danger of desire in public life. They also invite reflection. What does it mean to be remembered not for one's deeds, but for one's intimacy? Antinous did not conquer, legislate, or rule, yet he became immortal through love. Elagabalus's lovers, by contrast, became infamous, remembered only as cautionary tales. The line between veneration and vilification was as thin as a blade. As we leave Rome's palaces, the question lingers like incense in a temple. Is love diminished when it entwines with power? Or does it, by its very survival, prove that even emperors are human? The call to prayer echoed over Baghdad, a song of devotion rising above domes and minarets. The city, jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, pulsed with trade, learning, and faith. Its libraries gathered the wisdom of Greece, Persia, and India. Its markets overflowed with silks, spices, and jewels. Yet within the heart of its palaces, behind latticed screens and guarded doors, another world existed, one where law, desire, and silence clashed. Here, in the caliph's harem, whispers carried more weight than decrees, and among the silken shadows moved not only women, but also men. The Islamic world presented itself as bound by divine law, yet the practice of concubinage endured, woven into empire. The Quran permitted concubines in certain contexts, but the reality of the harem grew far beyond scripture, shaped by politics, culture, and human desire. Eunuchs, young men, and favorites became central figures in this secret world, where intimacy could transform into influence. The contradiction was striking. Clerics condemned illicit acts, yet caliphs themselves surrounded their lives with those very temptations. The eunuch was often at the center, castrated in youth, frequently taken from Africa, the Balkans, or Central Asia. These men were seen as safe guardians of the harem, unable to sire children and thus incapable of threatening dynastic succession. Yet their roles extended beyond guardianship. Some were elevated as confidants, managing access to the caliph, controlling letters, secrets, and appointments. Their scar marked them as less than men in the eyes of society, yet within the palace they could wield power greater than generals. Alongside eunuchs were the Gilman beautiful youths, often enslaved, trained in poetry, music, and refined manners. They served wine, recited verse, and, at times, shared the caliph's intimacy. Court poets wrote openly of love between men, cloaking desire in metaphor but leaving little doubt of its reality. Abu Nuwas, the infamous poet of Baghdad, sang of boys with lips like pomegranates and eyes like dark wine. His verses, scandalous yet celebrated, mirrored a truth. In the Abbasid court, male beauty was both ornament and temptation. The contradiction deepens when law meets practice. Islamic jurists debated the boundaries of desire, issuing stern warnings against forbidden acts. Yet caliphs, who were both rulers and men, often ignored such prohibitions in private. Their harem became a place where divine ideals bent before the weight of passion and politics. It was a hypocrisy everyone recognized, yet few dared to confront openly. To question the caliph's desires was to question the man chosen to lead the faithful a perilous act. Among the Abbasid caliphs, stories abound of favorites whose presence stirred both envy and scandal. Al-Amin, son of Harun al-Rashid, was said to have doted excessively upon male companions, neglecting affairs of state. Chroniclers, eager to cast blame for political failures, highlighted these indulgences as proof of weakness. Yet even if colored by bias, the accounts reveal the reality that intimacy in the harem often spilled into governance. Those who shared the caliph's bed could whisper in his ear, sway his decisions, and provoke the jealousy of viziers and generals. The motif of silence is thick here. Many of these men remain nameless, recorded only in vague accusations or fleeting verses. The silence was both deliberate and strategic. To expose them was to tarnish the caliph, yet to ignore them entirely was impossible. History thus preserves them only as shadows, anonymous figures moving through gilded halls, their existence undeniable but their voices unheard. Beyond Baghdad, similar practices spread throughout the Islamic empires. In Cordoba, the caliphs of Al-Andalus surrounded themselves with male attendants and companions, echoing the Abbasid model. In Cairo, the Fatimid palaces teemed with eunuchs, who managed not only harems but the machinery of the state. In each case, intimacy and power were entwined, hidden behind the rhetoric of piety yet alive in the rhythms of courtly life. The motif of scars also belongs here, as it did in China and Mesopotamia. For eunuchs, the wound was literal, a physical mark of their coerced role. For favorites, the scar was more subtle loss of freedom, the burden of envy, the ever-present risk of disgrace. A beloved today could be a corpse tomorrow, should rivals succeed in turning affection into accusation. The harem was not only a sanctuary of pleasure, but a battlefield of politics, fought with smiles, silences, and insinuations. The poets remind us, however, that amidst this peril, tenderness could exist. Abu Nuwas, with his irreverent verses, dared to imagine love unashamed. His poems speak of laughter, of longing, of joy in the embrace of another man. Whether he reflected his own life or simply the atmosphere of the court, his words remind us that intimacy, however entangled with power, also carried the possibility of genuine affection. Perhaps in the quiet hours, away from the gaze of courtiers and rivals, a caliph and his chosen companion shared something real, something neither law nor politics could erase. And yet, we must ask, can love survive in such a chamber, when every glance is measured, every gift resented, every whisper a potential weapon? Is affection ever free? Or is it always chained by fear and calculation? The harem raises this question with haunting force. The whispers of the caliph's harem are not confined to history. They speak to us still, reminding us that human desire resists confinement even under the weight of religion and empire. They reveal the fragile humanity of rulers who, despite titles and divinity, were as vulnerable to longing as any man. And they reveal the cost borne by those who gave themselves, willingly or not, into that forbidden world. As we leave the palaces of Baghdad, the call to prayer rises once more. Outside, the faithful bow in devotion, seeking order in divine law. Inside, the torchlight flickers on silken drapes, where silence guards its secrets and the memory of those whispers lingers, like incense long after the flame has died. The city of Constantinople shimmered like a jewel upon the Bosporus. Its domes glistened in the sun, mosaics sparkled with golden tesserae, and its walls, mighty and impregnable, guarded the empire of Byzantium for centuries. Yet, behind those walls, amid incense-laden chapels and marble corridors, another world thrived, a shadow court of eunuchs, attendants, and favorites, whose intimacy with emperors shaped the destiny of the empire as surely as armies and treaties. Byzantium, heir to both Rome and the Christian faith, projected an image of piety and order. Emperors were crowned not only as rulers, but as God's chosen guardians of the Orthodox faith. Officially, the moral code of Christianity condemned excess, especially sensual indulgence. Yet within the great palace, reality proved far more complex. Desire did not vanish with baptism. It merely cloaked itself in secrecy. Eunuchs dominated the Byzantine court like nowhere else. From the 4th century onward, they became indispensable, serving as chamberlains, generals, diplomats, and advisors. Their castration, often performed in childhood, rendered them ineligible for dynastic succession, which paradoxically made them more trustworthy in the eyes of rulers. To many emperors, eunuchs were not diminished men, but instruments of stability. Yet, this mutilation was also the price of entry into a world where proximity to power meant both privilege and peril. Some eunuchs remained mere servants, but others rose to staggering heights. Narses, a eunuch general of the 6th century, commanded armies for Emperor Justinian, playing a decisive role in the reconquest of Italy. Others became chief chamberlains, parakoimomenos, sleeping in the room beside the emperor, guarding his secrets and controlling who gained access to his presence. To lie in such closeness to the sovereign, even platonically, was to stand in a realm where the boundary between service and intimacy blurred. Rumors inevitably followed. Chroniclers, eager to slander rivals or discredit rulers, often accused emperors of being enthralled by their eunuch favorites. Whether truth or propaganda, the repeated theme reveals the anxiety of Byzantine society, that desire in the palace could eclipse duty, and that the whispered counsel of a favorite might outweigh the decrees of law. The empire's survival seemed to teeter not only on walls and swords, but on the unseen bonds of affection within the imperial bedchamber. The motif of silence pervaded the shadow court. Official histories, penned by clerics and scholars, rarely named those who lay closest to the emperor's side. Yet satire, gossip, and hostile accounts preserve hints. Theophanes, the confessor, accused certain emperors of indulgence with male attendants. Others, like Constantine IX, were whispered to have granted their chamberlains undue influence. Each accusation carried more than moral judgment. It was political weaponry. To charge an emperor with weakness before beauty was to question his fitness to rule. And yet, there were emperors who appeared unashamed. Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty, was rumored to have risen to prominence through the favor of Emperor Michael III, whose affection elevated him from stable boy to co-emperor. Whether their bond was friendship, mentorship, or intimacy, its impact was undeniable. It altered the course of imperial succession. Michael's murder and Basil's rise only deepened the shadows, suggesting that proximity to an emperor could grant not only riches, but also thrones. The life of a male concubine or attendant in Byzantium was thus a balancing act of grace and fear. To be too beautiful was dangerous, drawing envy. To be too clever was perilous, arousing suspicion. To be too close was fatal, for favorites often fell with the ruler who loved them. Yet to be favored at all was also intoxicating, offering luxury, honor, and influence unimaginable to ordinary men. Christianity complicated this world further. Clergy thundered against unnatural acts, warning that sin in the palace invited divine wrath upon the empire. Yet bishops themselves often relied on eunuchs and attendants, recognizing their value in navigating court politics. This hypocrisy mirrored the broader Byzantine condition, a civilization poised between heaven and earth. where ideals and realities never fully aligned. The motif of shadows, so central to this chapter, reminds us that these men lived neither in full light nor full darkness. They existed in the penumbra, seen but not seen, remembered yet unnamed, condemned yet indispensable. Their shadows fell across thrones and altars, influencing decisions that shaped crusades, alliances, and the survival of Constantinople itself. Philosophically, the Byzantine shadow court invites us to ask, is power purer when divorced from desire, or is desire itself an inescapable part of human rule? Can we imagine emperors untouched by longing, or does such a vision deny their humanity? Perhaps the truth lies not in judgment but in recognition. The fate of empires is often decided not only in councils and battlefields, but also in the silent hours of intimacy. As we leave the great palace, the mosaics still shimmer in gold, but our eyes are drawn to the shadows between the tiles. There, in the spaces history sought to obscure, linger the whispers of eunuchs and favorites, whose presence shaped 1,000 years of empire. Their names may be half forgotten, but their influence remains woven into the fabric of Byzantium, silken, scarred, and eternal. The Bosporus glittered beneath the rising sun, and above its waters rose the domes and minarets of Istanbul. Within the sprawling labyrinth of Topkapi Palace, power was both visible and concealed. Courtyards echoed with the tramp of soldiers, scribes bent over ledgers, and the Sultan's decrees carried across continents. Yet, behind lattice screens, within chambers lit by oil lamps and perfumed with rose water, lay the true heart of empire, the harem. The harem of the Ottoman Sultan was no mere collection of wives and concubines. It was an institution of politics, ritual, and silence. Within it, every glance carried weight, every whisper could shift destiny. And though most imagine the harem as a world of women, it was also guarded, shaped, and sometimes steered by men eunuchs and favorites whose shadows touched the throne. The black eunuchs, many taken as boys from Africa, stood as guardians of this world. Castrated and trained, they controlled access to the Sultan's family, managed correspondence, and became indispensable intermediaries. Chief among them was the Khazlar Asa, the chief black eunuch, who stood at the nexus of power and secrecy. He could whisper in the Sultan's ear, sway appointments, and outlive viziers who commanded armies. His mutilation marked him as excluded from lineage, yet in practice it gave him influence beyond most princes. Alongside the eunuchs were the young men who served as pages, ish olanlar, chosen for their beauty, wit, and loyalty. Some were trained for administration, others for military service, but a few were drawn into the Sultan's personal orbit. These favorites might share his bed, his meals, his games of chess or poetry. For them, silken robes and jeweled daggers were rewards, but also signals of a role both intimate and perilous. Ottoman chroniclers, careful in their language, rarely described these relationships directly. Yet, European visitors, scandalized and fascinated, wrote accounts of the Sultan's supposed indulgence in male favorites. Some exaggerated, painting lurid images of decadence. Others observed with sharper insight, noting that intimacy in the harem was inseparable from politics. Whether a page rose or fell could alter alliances, fuel rivalries, even provoke assassinations. One such story surrounds Sultan Murad IV, remembered for his iron rule and fierce temper. Rumors spread that his affection for certain young men influenced appointments at court. When one favorite was accused of arrogance, rivals fanned the flames until Murad, in a sudden fury, ordered his execution. The message was clear. To be loved by the Sultan was to live in luxury, but to fall from his grace was to face death without appeal. The motif of blood runs deep in these chambers. Rival factions often plotted against favorites, knowing that the Sultan's affection made them dangerous. Poison in a cup, a strangling bowstring in the night, a sudden exile. These were the fates that waited for those whose beauty became too political. The very intimacy that lifted them toward the throne also exposed them to knives in the dark. And yet, the harem was not only a theater of cruelty, poetry, music, and art flourished in its chambers. Sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent composed verses that spoke of longing, companionship, and the solace of trusted confidants. While many poems were addressed to women, the ambiguity of language leaves open the possibility that some were inspired by male favorites. Within metaphor and symbol, love could be expressed without scandal, at least in writing. For the favorites themselves, life was an uneasy balance. A smile at the wrong moment, a gift from the wrong hand, could brand them as conspirators. Their beauty made them envied. Their proximity to the Sultan made them feared. Some chose to wield their influence subtly, whispering advice, securing posts for allies, or protecting their families. Others overreached, believing affection invincible only to find themselves silenced by silk cords in the dead of night. The role of silence was paramount. Official chronicles erased much, leaving only fragments. Silence served the state, preserving the Sultan's dignity and concealing the mechanics of desire, yet silence also served survival. For those who lived within the harem learned that words could kill as surely as swords. To endure was to master the art of saying little, of letting one's presence speak without provoking envy. Philosophically, the Ottoman harem forces us to consider the paradox of intimacy under empire. The Sultan was the shadow of God on earth, his body a symbol of divine authority. To touch him was to touch sacred power itself. But what did it mean for those young men who were touched in return? Were they exalted by proximity to holiness, or diminished by becoming instruments of pleasure? Was their survival an act of strength, bending fate to advantage, or an erasure of self beneath another's will? Some, like the great eunuchs of the empire, turned their scars into power. The chief black eunuch wielded authority that outlasted viziers, proving that even a mutilated body could command the machinery of empire. Others, nameless and forgotten, perished without record, their lives reduced to whispers carried in smoke from extinguished lamps. The Ottoman secret lies not in salacious tales of indulgence, but in the recognition that within Topkapi's walls, politics and desire were inseparable. To govern the harem was to govern access to the Sultan. To govern access to the Sultan was to govern the empire. Thus, the concubine and the eunuch were not merely servants of passion, they were threads woven into the fabric of power itself. As dawn breaks over the Bosporus, the muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. Beyond the palace walls, life stirs in markets and mosques. But within Topkapi, shadows still linger, and the secrets of those silken chambers remain sealed. The world outside may remember the empire for its conquests and laws, but within the palace, the memory of those who served in silence, who rose and fell through intimacy, still clings like incense to the stones. Lanterns glowed softly along the wooden corridors of Edo castles, their light flickering against painted screens of cranes and cherry blossoms. In the stillness of night, one could hear the rustle of silk, the faint clink of swords laid carefully aside, and the hushed voices of men bound not only by duty, but by intimacy. For within the world of samurai and shoguns, where loyalty was prized above all, a hidden form of companionship flourished bonds between men that were as tender as they were perilous. Japanese history, shaped by Confucian order and Buddhist restraint, did not erase such relationships. Instead, it wove them into the very fabric of warrior culture. The practice known as shudo, the way of youth, described relationships between seasoned samurai and their chosen companions, often adolescents who trained under their patronage. Though cast as mentorship, Shudo carried with it intimacy, ritual, and expectations that blurred the line between pedagogy and desire. In the great castles of the Tokugawa shogunate, whispers told of shoguns themselves who selected favorites among their retainers. These companions might share not only lessons in poetry, calligraphy, and martial discipline, but also the shogun's private chambers. The ambiguity of historical records makes certainty elusive. Officials wrote cautiously, and later chroniclers, influenced by changing moral standards, softened or erased details. Yet fragments endure, rumors of favorites elevated beyond their station, poems exchanged in secret, scandals that erupted when rivalries grew too sharp. Unlike in China or Rome, where critics framed such bonds as threats to lineage, Japan often interpreted them within the framework of loyalty. To submit to a patron's embrace could be seen not as humiliation, but as proof of devotion. The samurai's life was one of sacrifice, life offered in battle, dignity surrendered to honor, even the body given to reinforce bonds of trust. In such a world, intimacy itself became an extension of fealty. But intimacy never existed free of danger. For every poem that praised loyalty, there was gossip that mocked indulgence. A favorite might rise swiftly through the ranks, granted stipends, land, or authority, yet he might fall just as swiftly, condemned as arrogant, effeminate, or disloyal. Rivals at court sharpened their jealousy into accusations, and the shogun's temper could turn love into a death sentence. In the silent corridors of Edo Castle, affection was always shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. The motif of shadows lingers strongly here. A samurai was trained to move unseen, to kill in silence, to live in the space between honor and death. So too did the concubine or favorite exist in shadow, his role half concealed, his influence whispered rather than proclaimed. His life was a performance of humility, strength, and beauty, each gesture calibrated to preserve favor without provoking resentment. Yet there was also poetry. Samurai composed verses not only of battlefield courage but of longing. The waka and haiku of the era contain allusions to fleeting embraces, to the glow of lanterns on pale skin, to the sorrow of separation when duty pulled companions apart. These poems suggest that beneath the politics and power lay something deeply human, a yearning for connection in a world where death could come at any moment. The shoguns themselves were not immune. Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun, was rumored to have kept male favorites, surrounding himself with pages chosen for beauty and skill. Though official histories obscure the details, European missionaries in Japan whispered scandalous tales of indulgence at court. Whether exaggerated or not, such accounts reveal how the mere idea of male concubinage could unsettle observers, even when Japanese society itself regarded it with a certain measure of acceptance. Buddhism, too, complicated the picture. While some sects denounced indulgence, others adopted a more pragmatic stance, seeing desire as one of many human attachments that must eventually be transcended. In monasteries, intimate relationships between monks and acolytes were acknowledged, even if not celebrated. The warrior class, which often borrowed rituals and ethics from monastic discipline, carried similar ambiguities. Thus, male companionship in Japan was neither wholly condemned nor wholly endorsed. It was tolerated, ritualized, and hidden in plain sight. The motif of scars appears as well, not scars of mutilation, as in the Ottoman or Byzantine courts, but scars of duty. Samurai were bound by honor to end their lives by seppuku if they brought shame upon themselves or their lords. For favorites who fell from grace, this expectation was merciless. A lover accused of arrogance might be ordered to die by his own blade, his devotion measured in the depth of the wound he carved into himself. Love, in this world, demanded not only tenderness but readiness for sacrifice. Philosophically, the Japanese case raises a profound reflection. Can intimacy be purified by loyalty? If love exists within hierarchy, shaped by oaths and sealed with obedience, is it love or is it servitude, disguised as devotion? The answer may lie in the paradox that the samurai themselves embraced, that to serve was to live, and to die for one's lord was the highest form of honor. Within this world view, even intimacy became another weapon in the arsenal of loyalty. As dawn breaks over Edo, the sound of wooden clappers marks the changing of the watch. The city stirs to life, merchants setting out their goods, peasants hurrying to fields. Yet within castle walls another silence remains, filled with memories of embraces never written in official scrolls. The favorites of shoguns, the companions of samurai, remain shadows upon paper screens visible only when the lantern is lit from behind. Their stories, half erased, remind us that power is not only measured by armies or decrees, it is also written in the bonds of trust, intimacy, and silence that exist behind closed doors. And in the end, perhaps the truest loyalty is not found on the battlefield, but in the hidden bonds of the night. The moon rose over Isfahan, casting silver light upon tiled domes and the flowing waters of palace gardens. Cypress trees stood like sentinels, nightingales sang in the shadows, and fountains shimmered beneath the stars. It was here, in the courts of Safavid Persia, that desire and power mingled in ways at once delicate and dangerous. Among roses and jasmine, emperors sought companionship not only from wives and maidens, but also from young men whose beauty was celebrated in poetry and whispered about in scandal. Persian culture carried within it a profound love of beauty, expressed in miniature paintings, illuminated manuscripts, and verses of lyric poetry. Within this aesthetic world, male beauty was exalted as a reflection of divine perfection. Poets likened the curve of a boy's cheek to the crescent moon, his eyes to dark narcissus flowers, his lips to rubies steeped in wine. The beloved in Persian poetry was often deliberately ambiguous, sometimes female, sometimes male, sometimes both at once. In this ambiguity lay a freedom to speak of longing that transcended boundaries. The Safavid Shahs inherited this tradition and embodied its contradictions. Shah Abbas I, remembered as a brilliant strategist and patron of art, surrounded himself with pages and attendants chosen for their youth and elegance. European travelers to his court, both fascinated and scandalized, remarked on the presence of beautiful boys serving wine and music in the royal chambers. Some hinted at indulgences that blurred the line between service and intimacy. For the Shah, to be attended by such figures was a display of refinement, but also a signal of dominion, his ability to command not only armies, but desire itself. The Persian garden, so carefully cultivated, mirrored this tension. It was a space of order and harmony, yet within its walls, shadows concealed indulgence and rivalry. A favorite might be honored with jewels, fine robes, or even a place beside the Shah at feasts. But just as easily he might fall from grace, his beauty fading, his rivals conspiring, his life extinguished in silence. In this garden of night, fragrance mingled with fear. The motif of memory was central to Persian love. Poets wrote not only of longing, but of remembrance, the aching sweetness of recalling, a smile, a voice, an embrace. For concubines and favorites, memory was both gift and curse. A night with the Shah might grant momentary ecstasy, but memory lingered long after favor was lost, a wound that could never fully heal. How many attendants, dismissed or disgraced, carried with them the ghost of intimacy, a memory both cherished and unbearable. Religion added another layer of contradiction. Islam, dominant in Persia, imposed moral limits. Yet Sufi mystics often used the language of earthly love, sometimes addressed to beautiful boys as allegory for divine longing. The beloved's face became a mirror of God's beauty. The pain of separation echoed the soul's yearning for the eternal. In this mystical framework, desire itself was not sin, but a path, however perilous, toward transcendence. Did the Shahs see their own indulgence through such a lens? Or did they simply revel in the pleasures of the moment? The ambiguity remains. European observers often judged harshly. Jesuit missionaries and merchants wrote letters describing what they saw or what they imagined in the Safavid court. To them, the presence of male concubines was proof of decadence, a moral failing that weakened Persia's strength. Yet these same observers often admired the artistry and grace that surrounded such figures, betraying their own fascination. Their words reveal not only the practices of the court, but also the cultural chasm between East and West, where desire was framed differently, hidden differently, condemned differently. The motif of scars emerges here as well, though less from physical mutilation than from emotional cost. For favorites, the scar was the knowledge that they were both celebrated and disposable. Their beauty was a candle that burned brightly, but briefly. Once extinguished, it left only smoke and ash. Some turned to poetry themselves, writing verses of regret, longing, or lament. Their voices rarely reached beyond the palace, but echoes survive in manuscripts that speak of sorrow as eloquently as of joy. Perhaps the most haunting truth of the Persian garden of night is its blending of tenderness and politics. A glance could alter fortunes, a kiss could stir envy, a rumor could spark downfall. And yet, in the midst of intrigue, there were moments of genuine affection, a Shah cutting short a feast to sit in private with a beloved page, a poem whispered by candlelight, a shared walk among cypress trees. These fleeting intimacies remind us that even within systems of power, the human heart sought solace. Philosophically, Persia teaches us that beauty is both gift and curse. To embody beauty was to be cherished, but also to be consumed. To love beauty was to glimpse eternity, but also to risk ruin. The garden itself becomes metaphor, a place of harmony designed by human hands, yet vulnerable to decay, invasion, and time. In the same way, the intimacy of the concubine was cultivated, controlled, and celebrated, yet ultimately fragile, destined to fade. As the night deepens over Isfahan, fountains still murmur, and moonlight gleams on turquoise tiles. But behind the fragrance of roses lies another scent, the memory of those who walked these gardens, clothed in silk, adorned with jewels, carrying both the honor of favor and the burden of silence. Their names are mostly lost, yet their presence lingers in poetry, in rumor, in the very air of the Persian night. And so we leave the Garden of Night with a question. Is beauty meant to be possessed, or only to be witnessed? For the concubines of Persia, possession was both their fate and their undoing, and memory their only immortality. The Mughal Empire rose like a tapestry woven from threads of conquest, faith, and beauty. Its palaces gleamed with marble inlaid with jewels, its gardens bloomed in symmetrical harmony, and its courts pulsed with poetry, music, and ceremony. At its heart stood emperors Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, each shaping history with sword and decree. Yet behind the shimmer of peacock thrones and the solemnity of imperial rituals lay another story, faintly drawn in silhouette, the presence of male concubines and favorites, figures rarely spoken of, but never entirely absent. The Mughals inherited Persian culture, and with it the ambiguities of desire. Babur, the empire's founder, left memoirs, the Baburnama, in which he confessed his youthful passion for a boy named Baburi in Samarkand. His words, tender and vulnerable, stand out against the martial tone of his conquests. "I had never felt such emotion for anyone," he wrote, describing the pain of longing and the ecstasy of a stolen glance. Though later chroniclers tried to soften or obscure these passages, they remain among the most intimate revelations of any emperor. In them we see not a conqueror, but a man pierced by love. In later generations, male companionship became less openly acknowledged, but persisted in practice. The Mughal court was steeped in Persian aesthetics, where beauty, male and female, was celebrated through miniature painting and verse. Young attendants, chosen for their elegance, served wine, recited ghazals, and adorned the emperor's chambers. Some were companions in leisure, others perhaps in intimacy. The ambiguity of art allowed truths to be concealed. A painting might show two figures reclining together, eyes meeting in coded affection, yet no official caption would admit what the brush revealed. The motif of shadows is apt here. Male concubinage in Mughal India existed not in open proclamation, but in subtlety hidden glances, coded poetry, rumors whispered in corridors of sandstone and marble. The empire projected an image of order rooted in Islamic piety, especially under rulers like Aurangzeb, whose stern orthodoxy brooked no public indulgence. Yet, even in his reign, the private chambers of nobles and courtiers hummed with practices never written into law. Shadows allowed what light condemned. The poets, as always, bore witness. Ghazals and masnavis spoke of longing for the beloved, often without specifying gender. The beloved's downy cheek, his sword-like glance, his ruby lips, these phrases appear again and again in Mughal verse. While later readers might interpret them as metaphor, in their time they carried double meanings, known to audiences attuned to the subtleties of Persian poetic tradition. Desire for young men was acknowledged not through proclamation, but through art's veil of ambiguity. The motif of memory also lingers in Mughal narratives. Jahangir, known for his devotion to wine and pleasure, recorded in his memoirs the joy of companionship. His court, filled with dancers, singers, and attendants, blurred lines between entertainment and intimacy. Paintings from his era depict gatherings where youths in jeweled turbans pour wine into jade cups, their beauty highlighted as much as their service. Were they merely servants, or silhouettes of something more? The silence of official chronicles forces us to guess, but the imagery suggests lives entwined with both pleasure and politics. The Mughal harem, like its Ottoman counterpart, was imagined by outsiders as a world of women. Yet eunuchs guarded its gates, managed its affairs, and at times served as confidants to the emperor himself. Their scars were both physical and symbolic, denied family, yet entrusted with empire. Some rose to positions of extraordinary influence, shaping succession struggles and policy from behind the curtain. Their presence reminds us that intimacy at court was never divorced from politics. Rivalries often sharpened around these shadowy figures. A favorite granted too much favor could become the target of resentment, his fall engineered by jealous nobles. The Mughal court, rife with intrigue, used rumor as a weapon. A whisper of undue intimacy could tarnish reputation, weakening both the emperor and his chosen companion. Thus, love was never free of consequence. Yet amidst the peril, there were also genuine bonds. The tenderness of Babur's confession, the intimacy glimpsed in poetry, the gaze captured in paintings all suggest that love, or something resembling it, did exist. These were not merely transactions of power, but moments of human connection hidden within the machinery of empire. The silhouette, faint but persistent, tells us that even in the most hierarchical of worlds, desire could not be extinguished. Philosophically, the Mughal case raises a haunting question. Can something exist fully in shadow? If a love is never proclaimed, never written into official history, does it diminish its reality, or does secrecy give it a deeper power, a memory preserved in silence? Perhaps what is hidden is not erased but transformed, becoming part of the soul of a culture. Persian poetry, Mughal paintings, and whispered memoirs all suggest that shadows have their own kind of immortality. As dusk falls over the gardens of Shalimar, fountains scatter droplets like stars, and cypresses stand tall in ordered rows. Marble pavilions echo with verses once sung, glances once exchanged. The Mughal Empire may be remembered for its conquests and its monuments, but in the quiet silhouettes we glimpse another truth, that even emperors were haunted by longing, and even concubines shaped the rhythm of dynasties. And so the Mughal silhouettes remain figures half seen, half erased, preserved not in chronicles of war, but in the memory of poems, the lines of brushstrokes, the silence of marble at night. The palaces of Renaissance and Baroque Europe dazzled the eye, chandeliers ablaze with candlelight, halls echoing with music, courtiers resplendent in velvet and lace. Yet, amid the gold and marble, power often moved in subtler ways. Behind the etiquette of bows and curtsies, beyond the pomp of royal decrees, secrets flickered in the dim corridors of private chambers. And among these secrets were young men, pages, valets, and companions whose roles were far more complex than history's official portraits suggest. The Renaissance brought a new celebration of beauty, shaped by the rediscovery of classical ideals. Painters and sculptors reveled in the male form, chiseling muscles in marble, capturing youth in luminous oil. At the same time, courts grew ever more theatrical, where appearance and intimacy blurred into politics. Kings and princes surrounded themselves with attendants chosen not only for skill but also for grace. These secret pages were expected to serve wine, recite poetry, or carry messages, but their presence by the monarch's side was itself a form of spectacle. In France, rumors abounded about the affections of kings. Henri III of Valois, known for his love of finery and elaborate court rituals, was mocked by enemies for surrounding himself with handsome favorites, derisively called his mignon. Chroniclers accused them of effeminacy, indulgence, and undue influence. Whether these relationships were intimate or exaggerated by political enemies, the charge itself reveals the anxiety of the age, that a king's heart might be swayed by beauty rather than duty. The blade of rumor was sharp, and intimacy became its edge. The motif of blood was never far. Rivalries between favorites often erupted into duels, staining palace courtyards with crimson. The king's affection was a prize worth killing for, and young men, barely out of adolescence, fought to defend their honor and secure their place. To be a royal favorite was to live in splendor, but also under threat, for envy gathered like storm clouds over every smile bestowed by the monarch. In Spain, too, whispers circled. At the Habsburg court, where rigid ceremony defined every gesture, pages were chosen with extraordinary care. Their beauty was praised in letters, their closeness to the king noted with unease. Some rose to positions of authority, carried by favor rather than lineage. Others fell in disgrace, their names erased as if they had never existed. The silence of official chronicles hides much, but the gaps themselves speak. Where names vanish, secrets once lay. England was no stranger to such dynamics. James I, who inherited the throne after Elizabeth I, was widely known for his devotion to male favorites. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, rose from obscurity to become one of the most powerful men in the realm, sustained by the king's evident affection. Letters between them speak of tenderness, phrases like, "my sweet child and wife," suggesting a closeness that exceeded politics. Yet, Buckingham's influence stirred resentment among nobles and Parliament alike. To many, he was not only a companion but a corrupter, his intimacy with the king undermining the balance of governance. His eventual assassination left James desolate, proof of how love and politics could intertwine fatally. The motif of shadows returns here, for the life of a page or valet was lived in half light. Always present, rarely acknowledged, they moved like living ornaments in the royal household. Their beauty drew admiration, but their survival depended on silence. To speak too boldly was to risk envy. To show too much favor was to provoke suspicion. They were taught to bow, to smile, to obey, but never to reveal too much of themselves. Their existence was a dance upon a knife's edge. Art and literature of Europe captured glimpses of this world. Plays and satires hinted at the intimacy of monarchs with their favorites, often mocking rather than condemning. Painters sometimes immortalized these young men in portraits, dressed richly, gazing confidently, standing closer to kings than protocol would normally allow. Their presence in art preserves what chronicles attempted to erase, the fact that beauty, intimacy, and politics could not be disentangled. The Church, powerful across Europe, thundered against such indulgences. Priests denounced sodomy as sin, threatening divine wrath upon kingdoms that tolerated it. Yet the very frequency of denunciation suggests persistence. Monarchs might bow to the altar, but behind closed doors, desire whispered louder than sermons. The contradiction was stark, a world proclaiming Christian virtue, yet unable to sever itself from human longing. The motif of scars can be traced here too, not physical mutilation, as in the Ottoman or Byzantine courts, but scars of reputation. A king accused of loving too deeply could never fully escape the shadow of scandal. Henri III's name remains linked to his mignon. James I is remembered as much for Buckingham as for his policies. The favorites themselves bore scars of a different kind: envy from rivals, resentment from courtiers, the knowledge that their rise was tethered to the fickle constancy of love. Yet, amidst intrigue and peril, there were moments of undeniable tenderness. James I's letters to Buckingham radiate not calculation, but affection, yearning, and dependence. They remind us that even within the machinery of monarchy, the human heart beat strongly. To reduce these relationships only to politics is to forget that love, however entangled with power, was real. Philosophically, the European secret pages raise a timeless question. Does love diminish when intertwined with ambition? Or does ambition merely reveal the lengths to which love will go? Were these companions opportunists, or men who, like their kings, found themselves swept into bonds beyond control? History cannot fully answer. It leaves us only silhouettes, glimpsed in candlelight, their truths half hidden. As the music fades in a French ballroom, as the candles burn low in an English palace, as silence falls over the Spanish court, the presence of these young men lingers. They are the secret pages of Europe, remembered not in decrees or treaties, but in whispers, duels, poems, and letters. Their shadows fall across the history of kings, reminding us that power is never only political, but also profoundly personal. The torchlight of palaces has always burned brightly, but just beyond its glow shadows writhe with envy. To be the favorite of a king, caliph, or emperor was to bask in luxury and influence, yet it was also to stand in constant danger. For every robe of silk draped across the shoulders of a concubine, there were a dozen daggers pointed silently toward his back. The history of male concubinage is not only a tale of intimacy and power, it is also a chronicle of jealousy and of blood spilled when desire turned into threat. From Mesopotamia to Versailles, rivals watched favorites with bitter eyes. Their beauty stirred admiration, but their closeness to power aroused fear. To whisper in the ruler's ear, to hold his gaze across a banquet table, was to command a sway that no general or minister could rival. And envy, once ignited, demanded a price. The Roman Empire offers one of the earliest and clearest examples. The devotion of Emperor Hadrian to Antinous stirred admiration in some, but suspicion in others. Antinous' sudden drowning in the Nile remains a mystery. Was it accident, sacrifice, or assassination? Some scholars argue that jealous courtiers, threatened by the boy's influence, engineered his death. Whether true or not, the suspicion itself reveals how precarious the life of a favorite could be. To be beloved was to be vulnerable. In Byzantium, the stakes were even higher. Court eunuchs who gained the emperor's favor often found themselves targeted by factions of generals or patriarchs. A eunuch who lingered too close to the imperial chamber might be accused of corruption or treachery. Punishments were brutal, blinding, exile, strangulation. The blood of favorites stained the marble of Constantinople's palaces, proof that envy was as powerful a force as love in shaping the empire's destiny. The Ottoman court likewise turned affection into peril. A page, elevated to the Sultan's side, could rise overnight from obscurity to luxury. But his sudden prominence provoked rivals, viziers, generals, even members of the royal family who feared the boy's whispers might outweigh their counsel. Many such favorites were quietly eliminated. A sip of poisoned sherbet, a bowstring pulled tight in the night, a silent burial within the palace walls. The very silk that once caressed their bodies became the cloth that strangled them. In Europe, the blood price was often paid publicly. The mignons of Henri III in France, accused of arrogance and effeminacy, were despised by nobles who felt eclipsed by their influence. Duels erupted with shocking ferocity. In 1578, the so-called Duel of the Mignons left several young men dead, their blood staining the cobblestones of Paris. Though officially disputes of honor, these duels were also fueled by jealousy, the resentment that a king's affection had become a ladder for unworthy men. In England, the fate of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, illustrates the peril vividly. Though adored by James I, he drew the hatred of parliament and courtiers who despised his influence. In 1628, he was assassinated by a disgruntled officer, stabbed in the heart. The king wept, the kingdom rejoiced, and Buckingham became a symbol of how dangerous intimacy with a monarch could be. His blood was the ultimate price of envy. The motif of scars reappears here, not only physical scars from duels or executions, but the invisible scars of fear. To live as a favorite was to carry the constant dread of betrayal. Friends could become rivals, rivals could become assassins, and even the ruler's affection could sour into suspicion. The concubine lived not in peace but in perpetual tension, his beauty both his crown and his curse. Stories from the Abbasid Caliphate echo this pattern. Al-Amin, accused of doting excessively on male favorites, became a target for slander. When civil war erupted, his indulgences were weaponized against him, painted as evidence of weakness. Favorites in his harem were slaughtered in the chaos, their deaths less remembered than the scandal attached to their existence. Desire became not only a private danger, but a public excuse for violence. The philosophical question that rises from these tales is haunting. Why does love inspire such hatred in others? Perhaps because intimacy with power is the most coveted prize of all. To be loved by a ruler is to occupy the space every rival desires. And so jealousy, more than morality, often drove the violence. Those who accused favorites of corruption or sin often cared less about virtue than about influence slipping from their own grasp. The motif of blood running through this chapter is not merely literal. It symbolizes the way desire entangles itself with mortality. The favorite lives closer to power than anyone else, but also closer to death. His life is a candle placed beside a curtain. It glows brightly, but at any moment it may set the world aflame and consume itself in the process. And yet, despite the danger, young men continued to step into this role. Why? Perhaps because the promise of silk outweighed the threat of the blade. Perhaps because ambition, like desire, blinds one to peril. Or perhaps because even in the darkest palace, the chance of tenderness, even fleeting, was worth the risk. As we leave this gallery of blood and envy, the lesson echoes sharply. Intimacy with power is never free. It exacts a toll measured not only in whispers and scars, but often in life itself. The favorites of kings, sultans, and emperors lived poised between ecstasy and annihilation, and history, cold and unflinching, records their fall more readily than their joy. So we ask, is it better to live in obscurity, safe from envy, or to burn brightly for a moment, even if the flame consumes you? The answer remains as elusive as the shadows where these stories unfold. A concubine was expected to be silent, obedient, ornamental. He was meant to please, not to rule, to adorn the chamber, not to shape the empire. Yet, history records exceptions, men who transcended their role as favorites and seized the levers of power itself. Draped in silk, yet armored in cunning, they wore what might be called the mask of power, a face that appeared submissive but concealed ambition, sharp as steel. In Byzantium, eunuchs often rose beyond the shadows of intimacy into the blaze of political authority. Their closeness to emperors gave them unparalleled access, and their inability to produce heirs made them seem safe. Yet many proved anything but safe. Basil Lecapenos, an illegitimate son of an emperor and a eunuch, became the most powerful man in the empire during the 10th century. Though never emperor himself, he controlled appointments, military campaigns, and finances, his shadow stretching across Christendom. He had begun as a servant, Yet by mastering the court's labyrinth, he outshone generals and patriarchs alike. In the Ottoman Empire, the chief black eunuch, or Kuzlar Ağası, wielded influence so vast that ambassadors described him as the second most powerful figure after the Sultan. His control of the harem gave him leverage over succession itself. By deciding which princes could see their mothers, by filtering the whispers of concubines, he shaped futures of empires. His scar was his castration, but his mask was authority, unquestioned, indispensable, feared. Europe, too, knew such figures. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was not content to be the beloved of James I of England. He became a statesman, an admiral, and a broker of alliances. His beauty opened the king's heart, but his ambition reached beyond the chamber. He negotiated treaties, commanded fleets, and manipulated Parliament. His enemies accused him of arrogance and incompetence, yet his dominance of the political stage proved that a royal favorite could become, in effect, a co-ruler. France offers another striking example. Cardinal Richelieu is remembered as the architect of French absolutism, but beneath his austere title lies the story of how proximity to royal intimacy could transform into total control. Though not a concubine in the traditional sense, his mastery of the shadow role, servant in appearance, ruler in truth, reveals the same mask. And around Louis XIII himself swirled rumors of favorites who held his affection as much as his ministers did his loyalty. In such courts, the line between love and governance dissolved. The motif of masks is apt. A concubine who sought power could never reveal his full intent. He must smile humbly, serve loyally, and bow deeply, all while weaving plots behind lowered eyes. His mask was his protection. To reveal ambition openly was to invite ruin. To hide it beneath the guise of beauty was to survive. The court was a theatre, and the concubine turned statesman played his role with skill, lest the audience jealous nobles, suspicious clerics, or the ruler himself detect the truth. Persia, too, tells of favorites who reshaped empires. In the Safavid court, eunuchs managed not only the harem, but also finances and diplomacy. Some negotiated with foreign ambassadors, their words carrying the weight of the Shah. Their scars rendered them outsiders, yet their intimacy with power made them indispensable. They embodied the paradox of the mask, excluded from lineage, yet architects of policy. The danger, however, was ever present. A favorite who reached too high risked being seen not as a servant, but as a rival. History is littered with their falls. Buckingham stabbed by an assassin, Ottoman eunuchs strangled by bowstrings, Byzantine chamberlains blinded and cast into monasteries. The mask of power could protect, but only for so long. Eventually, envy and fear tore it away. Yet for all the risk, some achieved legacies that outlived their scandals. Basil Lecapenus's reforms, the Ottoman eunuch's management of succession, Buckingham's shaping of early Stuart politics, all left marks upon history itself. These men were not remembered only as concubines, but as statesmen, generals, ministers. Their intimacy with rulers gave them opportunities denied to most, but it was their intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness that allowed them to transcend. Philosophically, the mask of power asks us to reconsider what it means to rule. Does legitimacy come only from birth, blood, and crown? Or can it be seized by proximity, wit, and the subtle art of influence? If a concubine shapes policy, does it matter that his authority derives from desire rather than inheritance? Perhaps power itself is always a mask, worn to disguise its true origins. The motif of shadows intertwines with this mask, for even as these men rose, their legitimacy remained questioned. Nobles called them usurpers, historians painted them as corrupt, enemies used their intimacy as a weapon against them. They ruled, but always in shadow, never fully acknowledged, their faces half hidden behind accusations of sin. Yet shadows can be powerful too, for what is unseen is often most feared. In the end, the mask of power reveals that concubines were not always passive ornaments. Some were architects of dynasties, their decisions shaping nations. Their scars did not prevent them from ruling. Their silence did not erase their influence. They remind us that history is not only made by those who wear crowns openly, but also by those who, masked and half forgotten, stood behind the throne. As the curtain falls on this chapter, we are left with a reflection. Power rarely speaks in its own name. It smiles through masks, whispers through shadows, and hides behind silk. The concubines who became rulers without thrones teach us that authority is not only a matter of blood, but of presence and sometimes of desire itself. The palace chamber is a paradox, gilded ceilings and jeweled lamps, yet within them hearts that tremble between devotion and fear. For the male concubine, intimacy with a ruler was both the greatest privilege and the most suffocating chain. But beneath the layers of silken ceremony lies a question that transcends centuries. Could such relationships ever be genuine love, or were they always acts of survival? Across empires, fragments of evidence hint at both answers. Some stories breathe of tenderness so raw they cannot be dismissed as mere performance. Others reveal calculated obedience, where smiles were worn like armor and affection was crafted to ensure survival. The line between love and strategy blurred, and perhaps for many it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. Consider again the story of Hadrian and Antinous. Hadrian, Emperor of Rome, had access to anybody he wished. Antinous, a youth from Bithynia, had little choice in entering the emperor's orbit. And yet, the depth of Hadrian's grief after Antinous' death, the temples built in his honor, the statues raised across the empire, suggests that affection exceeded mere indulgence. Was it love? Or was it the emperor's projection of beauty, divinity, and immortality onto a beloved who had no power to refuse him? Perhaps it was both love for the emperor, survival for the youth. In China, the tale of Emperor Ai and Dongxian evokes similar ambiguity. The emperor's cutting of his sleeve rather than disturbing his lover's rest has echoed for centuries as a symbol of tenderness. But Dongxian's rapid rise in wealth and office, followed by his forced suicide when rivals struck back, suggests that his position depended entirely on imperial favor. Did Dongxian love the emperor? Or did he bow with perfect grace because survival demanded it? Or did survival itself give birth to genuine love, nurtured in the fragile hours when power loosened its grip and only two men remained, side by side? The Abbasid courts, alive with poetry, hint that affection could flourish even in gilded cages. Abu Nuwas wrote verses filled with laughter, longing, and joy, suggesting that love between men was not only political, but deeply human. Yet within the caliph's harem, every embrace was shadowed by envy, every smile calculated against rivals. For some, poetry may have been the only space where love existed freely, beyond survival's grasp. The motif of silence weighs heavily here. Concubines rarely left their own voices in history. We hear of them only through the words of rulers, poets, and enemies. Their silence forces us to imagine, what did they feel? Did they learn to love their masters as a way of softening chains, or did they bury resentment beneath practiced gentleness, counting each day of survival as a small victory? Silence keeps us from answers, leaving us to wander in speculation, haunted by what is missing. Europe provides another angle. The letters of James I to Buckingham pulse with sincerity, calling him "my sweet child and wife." These words seem to pierce beyond politics. Yet Buckingham himself used his influence ruthlessly, grasping for offices and titles. Did he love James, or did he love the power James gave? Perhaps, again, it was both. In love, even calculation can grow roots of genuine affection. The motif of scars reappears, this time as emotional wounds. To love in such a world was to carry constant fear, the fear of disgrace, the fear of betrayal, the fear that affection was one-sided. For rulers, the scar was doubt. Could they ever know if they were loved for themselves, or only for the crown upon their head? For concubines, the scar was deeper. Could they ever love without losing themselves? And yet, human beings are capable of tenderness, even in captivity. The Persian poet spoke of memory moments of sweetness that lingered even when love ended in tragedy. A glance across a garden, a verse whispered in secret, a shared silence in a chamber heavy with risk. These fragments suggest that love, however fleeting, could bloom even where survival was the soil. Philosophically, this question touches the essence of human intimacy. Is love defined by freedom? If so, concubines could never truly love, for choice was denied them. Or is love defined by experience, the feeling itself, regardless of its origins? If so, then even coerced beginnings could blossom into real affection. Perhaps the truth is that love is not pure, but mixed, part tenderness, part calculation, part survival. The motif of dawn offers reflection here. Every morning, concubines woke uncertain of what the day would bring. Would the ruler smile upon them, or turn cold? Would rivals sharpen their envy, or would the night bring tenderness again? Each dawn was a reminder that love and survival were inseparable, twined like silk threads that could not be pulled apart without unraveling both. Ultimately, the stories of concubines remind us of love's fragility and resilience. In a world where every gesture could be political, love had to be carved in secret, hidden in small acts of mercy. A robe's sleeve cut to preserve sleep, a poem written in ambiguous verse, a statue raised to preserve memory. These were the fragile proofs that love, however compromised, did exist. As we leave this chapter, the question remains open, as it must. Can love born under power ever be real? Or is survival itself a kind of love, the instinct to remain, to endure, to find meaning in the gaze of another? The answer may not lie in history's chronicles, but in the human heart, which has always known how to love even in chains. The chronicles of kings speak of triumphs in palaces, of victories carved in marble and gold. But beneath these triumphs lay bodies of concubines who bore scars that history seldom recorded. Their lives shimmered in silk before the world's eyes, yet their wounds were hidden, buried under silence. To understand male concubinage fully, one must look not only at the luxury but also at the pain, the wounds unseen, both physical and psychological, that marked those who lived as shadows behind the throne. The most literal wound was castration. In many empires, China, Byzantium, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ottoman court boys were mutilated to transform them into eunuchs. This act was justified as a safeguard. By severing their ability to sire children, rulers ensured they could never establish rival dynasties. But The price was terrible. Performed without proper medicine, castration left many dead from infection or blood loss. Those who survived carried lifelong pain, urinary complications, hormonal imbalance, fragile bones, and voices forever altered. Their bodies became living reminders of violence inflicted for the sake of control. Yet the scar was not only physical. To be made a eunuch was to lose more than the possibility of family. It was to lose a part of identity, to be trapped between categories of manhood and otherness. Societies often mocked eunuchs as unnatural, effeminate, or monstrous, and yet these same societies entrusted them with the most intimate and powerful roles. The paradox was cruel, despised and indispensable, mutilated and empowered. Such contradictions etched wounds deep into the psyche, unseen but profound. Even for those who were not castrated, life as a concubine carried other wounds. Disease often spread within palaces where intimacy was forced and controlled. Some favorites contracted illnesses that left them weak or disfigured. Others bore the weight of repeated use, their bodies treated as possessions rather than persons. The luxury of jeweled robes and perfumes concealed the reality that these young men had little agency over their own flesh. Humiliation was another scar. To be paraded as a trophy of beauty, to be whispered about as an object of indulgence, to be mocked by rivals as a boy toy or pet, these experiences gnawed at dignity. A concubine might enjoy temporary splendor, but always under the gaze of envy and scorn. He was rarely judged for his wit, courage, or virtue, but only for his body and the favor it commanded. Such objectification corrodes the soul, leaving wounds no less deep than those cut by blades. Jealousy brought further suffering. As chapters 12 and 13 showed, rivals plotted relentlessly. A beloved today could be disgraced tomorrow, accused of arrogance, corruption, or treason. Many concubines met violent ends, poisoned, strangled, exiled. The uncertainty itself was a wound, a constant state of fear that prevented peace of mind. Every smile from a ruler was double-edged. It offered protection, but also painted a target upon one's back. The motif of silence is especially cruel here. Concubines themselves left few records of their pain. Official histories ignored their voices. Poems often disguised their perspective behind allegory. We must imagine their suffering through fragments, a eunuch's bitter satire in Byzantium, a poem of longing in Persia, a complaint preserved in a Chinese court document. Silence was both shield and prison. To speak openly was dangerous. To remain silent was to vanish. Thus, their wounds remained largely invisible to us, hidden as carefully as they were hidden from their contemporaries. Psychologically, the burden of survival carved scars of its own. To live as a concubine was to perform endlessly. Every gesture had to be calculated, every word measured. One could never relax fully, never reveal one's true self. Over time, such vigilance eroded the spirit. Even genuine affection, if it existed, was haunted by doubt. Was love returned or only endured? Did loyalty come from devotion or fear of punishment? These questions gnawed at the soul, leaving wounds invisible yet enduring. And yet, within this suffering, resilience also appeared. Many concubines learned to wield their scars as weapons, turning pain into strategy. Eunuchs in China and the Ottoman Empire built vast networks of influence, compensating for physical loss with political cunning, Survivors of disgrace sometimes reinvented themselves as poets, artists, or monks, carrying their wounds into new forms of expression. Their lives remind us that scars, while born of suffering, can also become sources of strength. The motif of shadows belongs here too. Scars often remained hidden, just as concubines themselves lived half-seen lives. Shadows covered their wounds, but shadows also preserved them. Though history tried to erase their suffering, the very absence speaks. Silence itself becomes testimony. The scars of concubinage are written not in chronicles, but in what chronicles refuse to say. Philosophically, the wounds unseen force us to confront a disturbing truth. Power often thrives by breaking bodies. Empires did not merely command loyalty, they carved it into flesh. The concubine's suffering was not incidental but structural, part of the very machinery that sustained palaces and dynasties. This raises a question as old as power itself. Can greatness ever be built without cruelty, or is suffering always the hidden foundation of empire? As we close this chapter, the glitter of palaces fades, and what remains is the quiet ache of those who endured within them. Their names are mostly forgotten, their stories half erased, but their wounds remind us that behind every throne stood bodies scarred by silence. These were the wounds unseen, carried through life, carried into memory, carried into history's shadows. The palace was not only a place of politics, it was a stage. Curtains of silk-framed chambers where rulers received their companions. Music floated through gilded halls, and every gesture carried meaning. Within this theater, male concubines were not merely attendants or lovers. They were performers, cast into roles that blended beauty, ritual, and desire. Their lives were lived as spectacle, choreographed for the gaze of rulers and courtiers alike. From China to France, Persia to the Ottoman Empire, the presence of male favorites was inseparable from performance. They were taught to move with grace, to speak in measured tones, to embody refinement. Some played instruments, others recited poetry, others danced or sang. Their very bodies became canvases upon which ideals of beauty were painted. Pale skin, delicate features, or youthful elegance were not simply personal traits but cultivated arts, honed for the ruler's delight. In the Abbasid courts of Baghdad, Gilman youthful attendants were trained to serve wine in elaborate rituals. They moved gracefully between guests, their robes shimmering with embroidery, their voices soft with practiced charm. Poets praised their allure, comparing their presence to moonlight upon dark rivers. Their service was not mere utility, it was theater, designed to heighten the atmosphere of luxury and intoxication. The caliph's court became a stage where desire itself was performed. In China's Tang dynasty, favorites were celebrated in banquets where music and poetry intertwined. Concubines recited verses that blurred the line between personal longing and political flattery. To pour a cup of wine, to bow with just the right angle, to sing a line of poetry at the perfect moment, all were acts in a script that signaled intimacy and devotion. The cut sleeve of Emperor Yi and Dongxian was not only an act of tenderness, it was also remembered as theater, retold in verse for centuries. The Ottoman world refined this spectacle even further. Within Topkapi Palace, pages and eunuchs were trained not only in administration and etiquette but also in performance. Some danced in private chambers, others staged mock battles, others sang songs of loyalty and longing. For the Sultan, these displays reinforced both his authority and his pleasure. To command beauty as well as armies was to embody total sovereignty. The concubine's performance was thus part of the empire's pageantry, no less than a military parade or a festival of conquest. Europe had its own variations. In France, The mignons of Henri III were mocked not only for their closeness to the king, but also for their theatrical displays, embroidered doublets, perfumed hair, choreographed duels. They were living ornaments, embodying elegance in ways that blurred masculinity and femininity. Their presence scandalized enemies but fascinated allies, reminding all that the king's power extended even to shaping beauty itself. The motif of masks belongs here. Every concubine was an actor, donning a mask of charm, humility, or passion depending on the scene. The mask concealed fear, ambition, or resentment, allowing him to play his part convincingly. Yet the mask was not mere deception, it was survival. In the theatre of desire, failure to perform could mean disgrace or death. Success, however, brought wealth, titles, and influence. The mask became a second skin, both shield and prison. The aesthetics of male beauty varied across cultures but shared common themes. Youth was prized above all smooth skin, unlined features, a body unmarked by labor. Ambiguity was often celebrated, beauty that hovered between masculine and feminine, strong and delicate, bold and submissive. In Persia, poets praised cheeks like roses and voices like flutes. In Japan, samurai companions were admired for both martial skill and graceful elegance. In Europe, portraits of favorites often highlighted their long hair, soft skin, and fashionable attire, presenting them as embodiments of refinement. But performance came at a cost. The constant demand to embody ideals eroded individuality. Concubines became mirrors reflecting rulers' desires, losing themselves in the roles assigned. Their scars, as we saw in chapter 15, were not only physical but psychological. To live as performance was to risk forgetting who one truly was. The theatre of desire dazzled with brilliance, but behind the curtain, exhaustion and despair often lurked. And yet, amidst the artifice, there were moments of truth. A song sung with genuine feeling, a poem written from the heart, a dance that captured not only elegance but longing. These glimpses suggest that authenticity sometimes broke through the mask. The concubine, even while performing, could find ways to express his own humanity hidden within the spectacle demanded of him. Philosophically, the theatre of desire invites us to ask, are we ever free of performance in love? Even in ordinary lives, affection often involves roles: lover, companion, protector, beloved. In the palace, these roles were exaggerated, formalized, and dangerous, but perhaps they reflect a truth universal to the human condition. Love is always partly theatre, partly mask, partly truth. The motif of shadows lingers again. Performance required lighting torches, lanterns, candlelight. In these shifting illuminations, beauty was heightened, desire intensified. Yet shadows clung to every gesture, reminding us that what was seen was not always what was real. The theatre of desire was dazzling, but its shadows concealed secrets, fear, ambition, silent sorrow. As the music fades in the palace hall, as lanterns dim and dancers retire, the echoes of performance linger. The concubine, now alone, removes his mask, exhales his exhaustion, and faces himself in silence. Was the affection he received genuine, or only applause for his performance? Was he loved for who he was, or for the role he played? These questions remain unanswered, echoing through the centuries. And so we leave the theatre of desire with a paradox. Performance both enslaved and exalted, degraded and beautified, silenced and revealed. The concubines who lived as symbols of beauty remind us that love is never free from performance, but within performance lies the chance, however fleeting, for truth to shine. The palace chamber may have been filled with music and silk, but outside its walls, the voices of philosophers and clerics carried weight. While emperors indulged in private, the public realm demanded justification, explanation, or condemnation. Across cultures, male concubinage existed in tension with systems of morality that sought to regulate human desire. The result was a long history of uneasy silences, outright denouncements, and occasional defenses, a philosophy of shadows, in which thought struggled to illuminate what rulers preferred to conceal. In ancient China, Confucian scholars viewed male concubinage as disruptive to order. The family was the cornerstone of society, and filial piety demanded marriage and heirs. A ruler absorbed in the charms of a male favorite risked neglecting his duty to continue the ancestral line. Memorials presented to emperors criticized indulgence, not always on moral grounds, but on political ones. The dynasty itself could collapse if the emperor's affection strayed too far from women. And yet, Taoist and Buddhist influences tempered this rigidity. Taoist texts sometimes celebrated male beauty as part of cosmic balance, while Buddhist monasteries quietly tolerated intimate bonds among monks and disciples. Thus, Chinese thought remained divided: Confucian condemnation, Taoist ambiguity, Buddhist silence. In the Greco-Roman world, philosophy approached desire more directly. Plato's Symposium celebrated love between men as a path to higher truth, where physical affection could ascend toward contemplation of the divine. Stoics, by contrast, warned against enslavement to passion. They urged rulers to govern themselves before they governed others. For them, an emperor, enthralled by a concubine, betrayed weakness. The contrast reveals the enduring tension. Is love ennobling or corrupting? Does intimacy with a favorite refine the soul or degrade the ruler's authority? Islamic thought, too, wrestled with these shadows. The Quran did not explicitly forbid desire between men, but jurists classified such acts as grave sin. Religious law tolerated concubinage with women, but intimacy with boys or men was branded illicit. Yet poets of the Islamic Golden Age wrote verses that reveled in the beauty of youths, often with startling frankness. Abu Nuwas sang of his passion for wine and boys, defying clerical rebuke with irreverent wit. The contradiction was sharp. Clerics thundered, poets sang, and caliphs quietly indulged. Islamic philosophy became a dance between denunciation and celebration, doctrine and lived reality. In Christian Europe, the condemnation was far harsher. Church fathers labeled same-sex intimacy as sodomy, a sin so grave it was believed to invite divine wrath upon kingdoms. Councils issued edicts against it, preachers warned of hellfire, and inquisitors sought confessions through fear. Yet, even here, shadows persisted. Monastic chronicles occasionally reveal tenderness between monks, cloaked in the language of spiritual friendship. Some theologians, like Aelred of Rievaulx, wrote treatises praising bonds of love between men, insisting they could lead to holiness if free of lust. Thus, even in the stern world of Christian doctrine, glimpses of nuance survived. The motif of silence emerges again. Philosophers and clerics often spoke about concubinage, but rarely allowed concubines themselves to speak. Their words were judgments, not testimonies. Silence was imposed upon the very people whose lives were most affected. We hear condemnation and defense, but rarely confession. The philosophy of shadows thus reflects not only morality, but absence, the absence of lived voices, drowned beneath sermons and treatises. Renaissance humanists revived classical ideals, praising beauty in ambiguous terms. Michelangelo's sonnets to his male muses, though wrapped in the language of spirituality, reflect the persistence of desire. Yet critics always circled, to praise male beauty was acceptable in art. To act upon it was perilous. The shadows allowed admiration, but punished indulgence. The motif of masks belongs here too. Moralists often wore masks of certainty, speaking as if boundaries were clear. Yet behind the masks, societies lived with contradictions. A caliph who punished sodomy might himself keep a beloved page. A Christian monarch who persecuted for unnatural vice might favor a handsome valet. The mask of morality concealed the shadow of indulgence. Philosophers and clerics often knew this, but to maintain authority they spoke with uncompromising voices. Philosophically, the issue forces us to confront the boundary between nature and morality. Is desire itself natural and only its expression condemned? Or is desire already corrupt when it strays from sanctioned roles? Different traditions gave different answers, but none fully erased the presence of concubines. This persistence suggests a deeper truth. Morality may condemn, but desire endures. Shadows remain, no matter how brightly doctrine shines. The motif of dawn provides a final reflection. Each age believed it had illuminated truth, Confucian order, Platonic love, Christian law, Islamic jurisprudence. Yet each dawn still left shadows where concubines lived. The philosophy of shadows teaches us that human behavior cannot be fully controlled by doctrine. Desire slips through cracks, finding expression in poetry, art, rumor, and silence. As we close this chapter, we recognize that concubines lived in the gap between morality and reality, condemned by words, yet preserved by desire. Philosophers tried to define, clerics tried to forbid, poets tried to celebrate, but the truth remains in shadow, where silence speaks louder than sermons. The concubine's chamber was meant to be a place of obedience, not defiance. The eunuch's role was service, not rebellion, yet history is never obedient. In the shadows where silence reigned, revolt sometimes stirred. Concubines and eunuchs, those thought powerless, voiceless, ornamental, occasionally became the architects of betrayal, assassination, or dynastic upheaval. Their silence, once broken, thundered louder than the clash of armies. In Byzantium, eunuchs often rose to astonishing authority, and with authority came rebellion. Some acted as kingmakers, deciding which prince would inherit, which emperor would fall. Basil Lecapeños, once a palace servant, manipulated imperial politics for decades, making and unmaking rulers with subtlety. Others, when dismissed or threatened, turned to conspiracy. Chronicles whisper of eunuchs who poisoned emperors, who guided assassins into guarded chambers, who struck when least expected. Their revolt was rarely open battle. It was a dagger in the dark, a secret alliance, a whispered plot. The Ottoman court tells similar tales. The chief black eunuch, master of the harem gates, sometimes decided succession itself. By controlling access to princes and their mothers, he could tilt the balance of empire. Rivals feared him more than viziers. Though his power usually operated in silence, there were moments when eunuchs acted decisively, backing one prince, eliminating another, shifting the course of Ottoman history. Their revolt was not against the Sultan directly, but against the structures around him, shaping dynasties in the shadows. Elsewhere, revolt was more personal. In China, eunuchs who endured humiliation sometimes seized vengeance. During the late Ming dynasty, eunuchs such as Wei Zhongxian became infamous, ruling the empire from behind the curtain. His rise was meteoric, his cruelty legendary. He purged rivals, elevated allies, and reduced emperors to puppets. His revolt was not a sudden strike, but a slow strangulation of imperial authority. Though his fall was brutal, he committed suicide to avoid execution. His story revealed that silence could indeed erupt into dominance. The motif of blood stains this chapter. Favorites who turned against their masters often paid in blood, but not before spilling the blood of others. Poisoned cups, strangled rulers, sudden assassinations. History records enough such acts to remind us that intimacy is not always loyalty. To share the ruler's chamber was to hold his life in one's hands. Most concubines submitted. A few chose to strike. Consider the case of Roman Emperor Elagabalus, whose reign was marked by scandal and indulgence. Ancient historians, eager to vilify him, claimed that favorites and attendants manipulated him, steering decisions for their own gain. Whether exaggerated or true, the image lingers. Concubines not as passive ornaments, but as subtle usurpers. In their revolt, they revealed the fragility of authority. The emperor who commanded legions could still be undone by a hand that poured his wine. The motif of shadows returns with force. Revolt was almost always born in shadow, invisible until the moment of eruption. A favorite might bow with perfect grace by day, only to conspire by night. His silence concealed not only obedience, but also calculation. Rulers often forgot this, mistaking beauty for harmlessness. They learned too late that shadows can conceal daggers. Not all revolts were violent. Some were rebellions of spirit concubines who resisted through poetry, satire, or withdrawal. In Persia, verses survive that mock rulers, thinly disguised as allegory. Perhaps some were written by favorites who, weary of servitude, turned their wit into weapon. In monasteries of Japan, where bonds between monks and acolytes sometimes blurred into concubinage, resistance could take the form of refusal, an acolyte rejecting the advances of a master, defying expectation at the risk of punishment. Even silence itself could be revolt, a refusal to flatter, a withholding of affection. Philosophically, these stories ask us, is revolt inevitable when intimacy is bound by power? When one life is wholly dependent upon another's favor, does resentment ferment until it bursts? Or are such revolts rare precisely because fear suppresses them? The examples we possess suggest both truths. Most concubines endured in silence, but the few who broke that silence changed history. The motif of scars deepens here. Revolt often left survivors scarred, not only physically, but collectively. Dynasties remembered eunuchs with suspicion long after individual conspiracies ended. In China, eunuch rule became a byword for corruption. In Europe, the names of favorites assassinated by rivals became warnings to future kings. Scars of revolt endured beyond lifetimes, shaping how societies viewed intimacy and power itself. Yet we must also see revolt as a form of agency. Concubines were often denied voice, choice, and dignity. To rebel, even through conspiracy or betrayal, was to reclaim a measure of control over their fate. Their revolt was rarely noble, but it was profoundly human. In choosing to act, they stepped from shadow into consequence. As we leave this chapter, the image lingers of a chamber dimly lit, of a ruler trusting a favorite, of silence suddenly breaking into violence. Revolt in the silence is a reminder that no intimacy under coercion is ever entirely safe, and that even the most obedient shadow can conceal rebellion. History remembers emperors with statues, battles with chronicles, and nations with monuments. But concubines, especially male concubines, were remembered or erased in far more fragile ways. Their existence was often inscribed not in stone, but in rumor, poetry, and silence. To examine their memory is to see how power chooses what deserves eternity and what must vanish into oblivion. The motif of memory begins with contradiction. In some courts, favorites were immortalized in verse, painted into murals, or celebrated in chronicles. In others, their very names were struck out, as if erasure itself could undo their influence. Between these poles, memory and oblivion, the figure of the concubine drifts like a ghost. Take the case of Antonius, beloved of Emperor Hadrian. When he drowned in the Nile, Hadrian refused to let memory die. Instead, he carved it into eternity. Cities were named for Antinous, statues multiplied across the empire, and temples rose to enshrine his beauty. Antinous became more than a concubine, he became a god. His memory, curated by an emperor's grief, resisted erasure and achieved immortality. Yet this was the exception, not the rule. More often, concubines vanished with brutal efficiency. In China, after emperors died, records of their favorites were purged. Eunuchs might be denounced, their names erased from official chronicles, their families punished. The Ming dynasty, suspicious of eunuch dominance, ensured that their stories were written as cautionary tales. Their memory became synonymous with corruption, their humanity obscured behind caricature. What the empire remembered was not their laughter, their poetry, or their tears, but their supposed wickedness. Erasure and distortion worked hand in hand. In Persia and the Ottoman Empire, male concubines rarely appeared in official accounts. The harems spoke through silence. Only when scandals erupted, when a prince died mysteriously, when a favorite grew too influential, did whispers escape into chronicles. Thus, memory of concubines became episodic, preserved not in daily life, but in sudden bursts of rumor. One might live for decades in service, shaping a ruler's every decision, yet be remembered only as a shadow behind a scandal. The motif of shadows therefore deepens. Memory itself can be a shadow, flickering on the wall of history, distorted by the torch of power. Concubines became figures of suspicion, half glimpsed, but never fully revealed. Their legacy was fragile, easily shattered by an emperor's whim or a historian's bias. Philosophy must pause here. Is memory truly a safeguard against oblivion, or merely another form of control? To be remembered is not always a blessing. Some concubines might have longed for erasure, to escape the shame or scandal attached to their names. Others, denied remembrance, might have yearned for even the smallest inscription, the faintest poem, as proof that they once lived and loved. History is not impartial. It is a stage where some are spotlighted and others consigned to shadow. Occasionally, memory survived through art. Persian poetry sometimes hints at beloved boys, their beauty praised in allegories of gardens and stars. Japanese tales of monks and their young attendants preserve fragments of intimacy. In Renaissance courts, satirists immortalized favorites by mocking them, ensuring their names survived not through reverence but ridicule. Thus, memory wears many masks: worship, slander, whisper, erasure. The motif of scars is present as well. Erasure leaves scars upon history. Gaps we cannot fill, absences we cannot explain. We know that concubines existed, that they shaped decisions, that they carried both love and resentment, yet their voices are missing. What we possess are second-hand accounts, chroniclers, moralists, enemies. The scar is not only what remains, but what is absent: the lost diaries, the silent songs, the unspoken confessions. One wonders what truths lie buried. Did Antinous write poetry to Hadrian that has since vanished? Did the Ottoman concubines of the Topkapi Palace leave letters hidden in walls, destroyed when dynasties shifted? Did eunuchs of the Forbidden City record their grievances in secret journals, burned upon their downfall? Every silence tempts imagination, but we must remain sober. History has already chosen which voices survive and which dissolve. At times, memory resurfaced against the will of rulers. Archaeology has uncovered inscriptions, forgotten murals, fragments of correspondence. In these remnants, concubines reappear, stubborn against erasure. Their faces return in broken statues, their words in fragile papyri. Memory may falter, but traces resist. Like shadows at dawn, erased figures sometimes return when light shifts. Yet what we most remember are not the individuals, but the archetypes: the beautiful boy, the manipulative eunuch, the treacherous favorite, the loyal shadow. These archetypes simplify, distort, but also endure. They tell us less about the real concubines and more about the societies that invented them. Memory becomes a mirror, reflecting not the lived truth but the fears, desires, and prejudices of those in power. As we near the end of this journey, we must ask, what is the true price of memory? Is it better to be erased, forgotten, left in peace, or to be remembered in distortion, worshipped as a god like Antinous, or reviled as a monster like Wei Zhongxian? Memory can grant immortality, but it can also chain the dead to endless caricature. In the chamber of history, memory and erasure duel endlessly. Concubines stand at the center of this duel, half present, half vanished, suspended between oblivion and remembrance. Their fate reminds us of a universal truth: no memory is complete, no erasure absolute. The past survives in fragments, and we who gaze upon it must learn to see not only what is written, but also what is missing. The motif of dawn closes this chapter. Just as dawn reveals what night concealed, so too does time sometimes restore what power erased. Perhaps the concubines who vanished into silence will someday be remembered more fully. Perhaps the fragments we hold are enough to honor them if we learn to read them with compassion rather than judgment. And so, this chapter ends with a question: is immortality found in being remembered, or in being free from memory's distortions? The palace is silent now. The echo of footsteps that once hurried through its gilded corridors has long since faded, leaving only the sigh of the wind that passes through cracked windows and empty chambers. Lanterns that once burned with the fever of passion have turned to dust, their ashes scattered across forgotten floors. The scent of incense, once heavy and intoxicating, has vanished into the hollow air. And yet, if one listens closely beyond the silence, beyond the centuries, there lingers a faint murmur. The voices of those who lived as shadows, who offered their bodies in exchange for proximity to power, who bore the scars of desire's cruel bargains. These voices belong to the male concubines. They were men who once held the gaze of emperors, kings, and sultans. They whispered words that could tilt the balance of dynasties. They endured the cruelty of jealous courts, the suspicion of armies, the contempt of chroniclers. Yet, in the official scrolls of history, they are but faint traces, sometimes mocked, sometimes demonized, often erased altogether. Their lives dissolved not with the thunder of rebellion or the grandeur of monuments, but with the softest of betrayals, silence. History itself, that great concubine of memory, chose its masters. It adorned some with jewels of remembrance, painting them as legends. It cast others into oblivion, stripping their names, denying their voices, chaining them to anonymity. For the male concubines, this was their second death, the erasure of remembrance. Their bodies had been sacrificed in service of passion and politics, and their identities followed soon after, into shadow. The fragility of power and flesh. To be a concubine was to live at the mercy of moods. A smile could raise them to unimaginable influence. A frown could plunge them into ruin. They lived closer to power than generals, closer to intimacy than ministers, yet their security was as fragile as a glass vessel held over fire. The male concubine's body was both weapon and prison. It granted entry into chambers forbidden to all others, but it also confined them. They were expected to please, to endure, to bend without breaking. Their skin bore invisible bruises, the weight of expectations, the burn of jealousy, the whip of secrecy. For in palaces where every gesture was recorded, they were paradoxically invisible. Their existence had to be hidden, denied, erased, to preserve the illusion of purity, masculinity, or divine authority. And so, they became prisoners not of walls but of roles. They were desired, yet despised, powerful, yet powerless, intimate, yet expendable. In their bodies, power and fragility fused into a single paradox. Scars that outlie flesh. Though flesh rots and names are forgotten, scars linger in strange ways. The concubine's existence shaped more than they knew. It is found in the architecture of forbidden cities, corridors built to shield secret chambers, hidden doors leading to private quarters. It is in the laws drafted in panic, designed to regulate intimacy, to forbid unnatural unions, to preserve dynasties from whispered threats. It is in literature where poets, unable to write openly, cloaked their verses in allegory. A moon-faced youth, a nightingale, trapped in the cage of a sultan's love. Their scars became society's metaphors. They haunted plays, novels, and folk songs. They served as warnings, cautionary tales about the dangers of letting desire stray too far into the realm of politics. In this way, though their names dissolved, their shadows lengthened, stretching across generations. Shadows in memory. Every empire has its hidden gallery. Faces never painted, names never carved in stone, lovers never acknowledged. Male concubines belong to that gallery. They are shadows in memory, yet shadows define the shape of light. The truth is that no empire was as monolithic as it wished to appear. Behind every throne were chambers of secrecy. Behind every law proclaiming morality were nights of transgression. Behind every dynasty's claim to divine order were concubines who bore witness to the frailty of kings. In silence, they remind us. Power is not as absolute as it claims. Even emperors trembled in their private moments. Even sultans needed warmth in the dark. Even kings, armored in ceremony, reached for hands that could comfort their loneliness. And often, those hands were not those of queens. The eternal question. The male concubines force upon us a question, one that lingers like smoke. Was their suffering the price of power, or the cost of being remembered only in silence? Some might argue they gambled with desire and lost, that they courted power and paid for it with their lives. Others might say they were victims, trapped by structures far larger than themselves, condemned to play roles written long before their births. But perhaps the truth lies elsewhere, in the recognition that power itself is always bound to suffering, that intimacy entangled with politics always bears a cost. Their tragedy was not merely personal, it was emblematic. They stand for all who have been used by power and then discarded, for all whose voices have been hushed to preserve the myths of rulers. Their silence is not absence but presence, a reminder that history is never whole, that memory is stitched together from choices about what to forget. The last chamber. And so, the story closes not with spectacle, but with quiet. Imagine a final chamber in an abandoned palace. The air is cool, heavy with the dust of centuries. On the walls, shadows flicker, as if unseen figures still move. A door creaks shut, and silence reigns. Within this chamber lies memory itself, reclining like a concubine, half hidden, half revealed. Its eyes glimmer with secrets it refuses to share. Its lips curve into a knowing smile. For memory, like desire, never belongs fully to us. It reveals only fragments, conceals what it must, and vanishes when we reach for it. The male concubines, those men of shadows and whispers, live on only in this space, in the uncertain realm between history and myth, between silence and speech, between presence and absence. Closing reflection. Fire has turned to ash, blood has seeped into soil, silence has replaced the music of desire. Yet their echo remains, not loud, not triumphant, but insistent. It reminds us that power is not measured only in battles won or monuments raised, but also in the hidden scars of those who lived in its shadows. What does it mean to be remembered? What does it mean to be forgotten? Perhaps the true legacy of the male concubines is this very question. They teach us that memory is fragile, that truth is elusive, that every empire has its shadows, and that even in silence voices may still linger. And so the storyteller leaves this chamber, closing its heavy doors. The echo fades, but the question remains, like a whisper carried by the wind. Their fate was silence, their legacy a question, their power a shadow.